Yeah.
Kind of like screw functional components. Kind of.
Um, we were taught essentially mostly class components. Recently, there's been
Because I was reading it, it was like you should write it as a functional
yeah,
component unless it needs to have
yeah,
access to process state or whatever.
yeah. They're
Because
moving.
it can slow down your
Yeah,
application, but I don't see anything that we would be building that would.
yeah. I wouldn't worry about that. I guess to touch on that real quick. Class components are more bloated, but they're more like feature rich. I guess you could say there's more you can do with a class component. You can have multiple methods and you can have it do a bunch of different functionality. I mean, you can do that with a functional component as well, but the purpose of a functional component is essentially to be just that, a function. Like, you don't want to have an enormous functional component that does a bunch of different stuff, because then it gets really convoluted and hard to debug. You want it so that you're building functional components for really simple things like submit buttons or something like that. You don't want to be building like an entire web page with a functional component. Now, I'm a junior developer. Take that with a grain of salt. But from what I've seen, I went to React meetups. They're talking about moving to functional components, but it's not quite there yet. And I think when they're talking about making that move, they're talking about commercial businesses switching from React class components to functional components. So
I was wondering because like I was thinking about like app ideas or something or whatever, and I was like, if I wanted a functional component to create a button on something, but what if I want it to have like the state of like what if this is an active button? I want it to be able to hover, like to be reusable, like would then I just create this simple button in a class component versus like
it really
even thinking
depends.
about making it as a functional component because that's like the simplest thing I could think of is a submit button or like a button. And then even then, like the simplest I can think, like I still would want it to be able to have access to the rest of like the information. Like I would want it to have that load. So why would I even get it and have it functional?
So there's two parts to that. One is that what technology stack and what your workflow is going to look like really depends on the company you end up working for. So if
So
you're
it's just important to know both just in case.
yes, there is still a move towards functional components, but it really depends on where you end up working after you're out of Galvanize because they could end up using Angular, which is fine. I'm sure that they would help you learn Angular. If you know React, then they're going to be like, oh, well, this is going to be a ballpark, walk in the park, rather. I forget the other part of my question. I'm super sleep deprived. I apologize. My friend was here up until yesterday, and we had to get him to the airport at 4 a.m. because he drunkenly made the wrong flight time. So I'm a little tired. I apologize. Does that answer your whole question, or?
Yeah, I mean it makes sense to understand both, but I was just wondering, would it be bad to like basically write everything in a class component, or
Right now, no.
right now no?
I would say if you were building a startup from scratch, then start trying to implement as many functional components as possible. But we're learning React. We're not trying to make these like groundbreaking, like Facebook apps. So like while we're learning,
Trying not to have to like think like, oh wow, what I really did need to access something, so then have to go and refactor my whole.
yeah, I think in my experience, classes were a lot easier to work with. Yeah, just be aware that they might not be around forever. And I'm talking like years. It could be like 2 or 3 years before they start phasing them out. But for now, while you're learning, classes are more than okay. What's up, Clarence?
So just to go off what you're saying, I think I don't know if you guys have heard about React.
React hooks, yeah, those just actually they came out with a new version recently.
I was reading an article this morning on the scene to show what scene situation. I was wondering when to use functional component versus class component. So this guy said in the article that when you want your component to have access to states and other features that class component provides, then go for class component. Other than that, just if you just want to create a body component that has nothing to do with states and stuff, then functional components that are created in
Mm.
but there is another feature which is React Hooks that allows you to access states even within the functional components.
See, there you go. So, one of the downsides of having a functional component was that it didn't have its own state. So I guess with React Hooks now they can have state. So you can see they're kind of trying to progressively move towards that direction. But right now they're not there. And to reiterate again, you guys are learning. So I'd rather you guys focus on learning and understanding what's going on than trying to differentiate between two things that are kind of arbitrary right now. But we'll get some functional component examples, but they really are just simple. It's not too bad. So this was the best example I could find you guys on slides. So this is jQuery. Unfortunately, we didn't go into a ton of jQuery, but essentially what's going to go on with this page is it's going to show you how we use React to take an enormous DOM manipulated HTML page and turn it into a very easy to understand, small and concise React component. So I'm actually going to back up a bit so you can see. Like I said, didn't have a ton of time to prep, so I was just grabbing everything. So we have this array, student names, right? And so we have a name, we have a photo. All right, cool. So then we have a function at a random index. We're going to grab, just some random student. Pretty easy to understand. So that's our function. So that's everything that was blocked out. Right, so this down here on the bottom right would just be like the DOM. Eventually pending those elements. So that is all jQuery, right? We don't have too much familiarization with jQuery, but this is what it would look like if we had to type this card out all with jQuery. So this is what React allows us to do. First, we're going to change it to a class. We're going to move that down. We're going to create a constructor. We're going to change this to render so that we're no longer using the profile prototype because we changed this to a class. I'm tripping over my cord. Render, since it's a class component, you have the class, then render, then return, as you can see down here. So we put in our render function, and render is where you would want to insert a lot of your arithmetic or JavaScript logic in between return. So let me back up a bit. Right here, well, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me speed forward here. So, and then I'll explain what I mean in a second. So here we have all these variables with jQuery. We're going to take this and turn it into this JSX React syntax. Obviously much easier. So we're kind of familiar with this, right? We have a variable called name. And then we want it to be a div with this.name, right? And then we're going to append it to whatever was going on. I don't know where name is, but it's being appended to the component. Yeah, thank you. we get DOM. So yeah, so this is JSX, makes it a lot easier for us. So now instead of having a component called div, we can just have a normal div. And then we're going to move return up, like I said. So up here, so what this is doing essentially is this would be like a constructor for state. We don't need to do this, but this is just showing you the gradual refactoring of taking jQuery into React. So this is a constructor, and this would essentially construct an instance of props, and then Super would call that instance of props so that when we render this component, it would have access to props, but that's generally not what we do anymore. That's generally not how React apps work. So we went from super props with this.name and this.photo to this.props, this.name. I think I messed that up, sorry. But we'll get on moving. So down here on the right, you can see what's going on in the app.js. We're rendering the photo. We have this new photo. What was just entered down there, s.name, s.photo, props.name, props.photo. But we don't need the constructor. So this would be a functional component, right? We're taking the class, which is extending the React component. We're turning it into a functional component. We're going to move the props as a parameter into that function. We're going to remove that entirely. But with a functional component, you cannot have this render feature here. And so that's where you run into problems where you have to do like JavaScript logic in a functional component, because whereas in a class component, you could do like mapping and for loops in between render and return, but you can't do them up here and you can't do them in the return. So with functional components, that's why they're so, right now their purpose for being so simple, like so you can see now what we have is we have a parent component. We'll just call it number 1, right? This marker is not that great. So we don't see this component right now, right? But when we return this component, we're returning, what are we returning? But when we return this component, we're returning profile. Pardon me, guys. Oh man, so much better. Return profile. But when we return profile, we're also sending props. So it doesn't matter that it's functional or classical. The only thing that matters in this instance, if we're on the parent component, is simply what the props are that we're sending to the component. So even though we just switched this from a class to a function, as long as we can send the props and the functional component can like correctly render the HTML elements and the information that we gave it, then it'll run much faster than a classical component, and it'll be a lot easier to read than a classical component. There we go. It's super duper easy. As you can see, you don't need this anymore. So yeah, you can see went from that huge line of code I was showing you guys at the beginning, and this is what React allows us to do. And another benefit of React is that it's reusable. So if you build like this really awesome nav bar on the top of one of your websites and you're like, man, I can't believe I made that, you can take that and essentially like port it. I don't think it's the right technical word, but you could just copy and paste it to another React project, and you can use it there as well. So React is awesome because it's reusable, but it's also really versatile. Any questions about anything I went over? We're all kind of familiar with React, right? The constructor is essentially this right here. So instead, like this, imagine this is props. I think I can do this thing where I color on it. Yeah. So instead, oh, I thought I could color on it. Dang it! It's just like a little weird tracer thing. Okay, so yeah, imagine this as props instead of name and photo, and then instead of this dot name equals name and this dot photo equals photo, it just turned. Oh, I have to go back down. It turns into this. So whatever's coming into this component, we call props, and then by calling super, so a constructor is essentially saying it's an instance of whatever you're calling it on, and then by calling super, what we're doing is we're instantiating that instance, or we're creating the props, essentially. You guys probably won't be using constructors with supers. That's more like a lower language thing, but if you're curious, feel free to look that up. We're not using that. Obviously, we're using this syntax, but yeah, like a constructor creates an instance, super instantiates the instance. So constructor describes what it's supposed to be, super creates it. Any other questions? Cool. So I actually have my my repo up from when I did this React assignment. So if anybody has any questions about if anybody has any questions about this project, I have it up here for you, and I can help and show you maybe what you're missing or something like that. It's up to you guys. Anybody have any questions about the assignment? I have some great resources too.
I just have a general question.
Yeah.
What is the best way to
Ignore the commit messages.
I was just wondering how like you don't want like anything really in there except for like references to other components, really, right? Like you don't.
Eventually, right now, you don't need to worry about that. You're thinking of Redux. So I actually have an example of that as well. So you can see this is my app. This is the project or assignment that you guys are doing right now, right? The card, yeah, and the items and stuff like that. So this is my app.js. This is my app.js, right?
Yeah, I was just wondering like
I'll
how.
comment to that stuff. But then with Redux, if we go into source and we go to my app.js, look at how much, I mean, excluding the comments, like look how much shorter it is.
Yeah.
Because there's so much more going on in Redux. You don't need to use app.js. It's kind of like a wrapper, so like it's still required, but it's not as heavily utilized as it is right now here with you guys. And then the reason you guys might be wondering like how is he able to just put a component? If you remember, oh jeez, wow, that looks like way bigger on my. Okay, I'm destructuring component up here when I'm importing it from React. So I'm importing React in addition to destructuring component. So that's why I don't need to put React.component. I just put component because I destructured it in the import. Yeah. I have some resources for you guys. Obviously, the React documentation. I thought this was important because I think some people get kind of confused as to what API means. Just because it says API doesn't mean it's like specific to JavaScript and you have to hit it with, you know, like a HTTP request. It simply means application processing interface. So when you come into React, make sure you go to the API reference because API reference is actually the documentation. And they go into everything as far as all of the methods, how to use them, what they do, the input, output, and then just as an example, a lot of coding libraries call their documentation API references. Right there, scripting API. So make sure you go to the React docs and then go to the API reference to make sure that you're using the correct methods in the right way and so that you know what to do and all that. We can go over it a bit more. It's a little more important in Redux. There's one main state in Redux. Redux kind of, it's like React on steroids. It gives you a lot more tools and functionality. So right now, as you guys know, we're passing everything down, you know. So we start with app, and then we have to pass it down to this, and then when we get here, we have to pass it down to that. What what Redux allows us to do is essentially connect all of our components to a central store or a state, and that's where all the information that needs to pertain in between pages will live. So like, I'm trying to think of two different examples. So like when you would want to have local state is like how many times a user clicked on a button. So like local state would be something like if there's a button and it's like the number of times clicked. You could probably store that inside of the actual component state. But as far as talking about like if the user, these markers, store /state. you guys read it?
Even better than the green.
I mean, I know it's really confusing right now. Gosh darn it. I got the- Thank you, sir. Whereas this would store something like if the user had a drop down, do like US and we'll do the little down arrow, right? We've all seen that where it has like the US flag and you click on it. That would be something you'd want to store in your actual Redux store / state. Whereas you wouldn't want to really necessarily store the amount of times they clicked on a button until you submit it or like you need the information back. Because the way React works is it re-renders all of the components that are dependent upon the action occurring. So like if you're using Redux and you have, like 100 parent elements up here, right? If you're using Redux, you can come down here and just use the one function without having to pass it down 100 times, which makes it super duper awesome. But as it works right now, it's like you have to pass, all the functions from app to the child component, and then all those from to the child component. I forget where I was going with that, but hopefully that answered somebody's question.
So it's like when we're to get like our shopping cart, for example, we want to have a state that says basically what the form's current state is, and then once we click submit, it's going to have us on that state, and then we can add its running state. Is that right?
Yes. So essentially in the app you have a function, and you take that and you pass it down to this so you declare the function in your app.js like I have right here. Update quantity. Can you guys see that? So we have update quantity, and this is all in my app directory, right? So import React, blah, 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 class extends, blah, blah, blah. So I'm declaring all my methods here, right? This dot set state, blah, 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 blah. But when I return, you can see I'm sending these functions down to these other components that I created. So essentially what Redux does for you is you don't need to do this anymore, where you say like send this function down, and then if I went to add items, right, so let's see real quick here. This is add item to cart. Let's take a look at that function. Add item to cart, right? So this dot set state, cool, return. So you can see here, this is where I'm doing all of my logic for storing the information. None of this functionality is occurring on the add to cart page or whatever. So this is the actual function that I'm sending down to add item to cart, or sorry, add items, yes.
Was there a reason to do the function in here versus doing it in the actual component?
Because you can't send data upwards. It's a one-directional data flow. So what that means, but it's with a caveat, like functional outputs can bubble up, but props can't bubble up, and it's like the other way around. So I'll show you. See here. So I have these functions on this class that pertain only to this specific component. But when I come down here, where is it? Might need to get the good old pointer out. Here we go. So see then here, I'm able to call it, I'm able to call it as if it's just like a method like dot floor or whatever, you know? So this component has access to this method because in its parent component, I rendered it with that prop that has that function. Does that make a little more sense?
Yeah.
Soon this will not be necessary. However, Redux is really freaking hard to understand. So in my cohort, they gave us the option if we wanted to do Redux. I took it and I liked it a lot, but it is a lot more confusing. So when you're ready and you hop into Redux, a lot of this kind of goes away. Not the syntax or anything or the workflow, but having all of these methods declared in your actual file, you're not going to have that anymore. Let's see if I can't find one. Yeah, see. Here's my class. There's all the information, setting state, render, return. I don't have this huge list of functions or methods associated with this class because they're all dealing with Redux stuff, I'll just say. So in due time, there will be a moment where we're no longer like loading up a ton of methods under our classes, but for now, that's what you should do. Unless you see a reason to use a functional component and you're confident that you can use it. Other than that, we got the documentation. This is how React works. I probably should have pulled this out before I started drawing terribly. So yeah, the app level component bubbles down to all the other components, and that's the data flow. But like I said, the functional flow isn't downwards, it's upwards. So like if you pass a function all the way down to the child component and then run it in the child component, it'll go all the way back up to the parent component and run it with the data in the child component. Unfortunately, that means you'd have to pass it through every intermediary component until you get to that child component.
So the way that you call it on the main one where the state lives is like event.target value, on the form. In the form, that's how you pull data is event.target.value.
On submit, and then you do e.prevent default. Yeah. I probably have like yeah, see. There you go. On form submit. Is that what you were looking for? And then here, I thought this was interesting too. Some people might be wondering why I'm declaring full item twice. Just remember that this is destructuring. This isn't me redeclaring full item, so that's why I'm able to use const twice, is because I'm not actually declaring full item. I'm declaring price and cents and name off of full item. That's why these are blue and this is black, and that's why this is blue in this area right here. Just a side note. Good? You want me to like slack out the specific function? So we're taking this dot items, which is what I call my props, and then we're using find, which literally just runs a callback function. And so then we're taking item and we're saying if it's equal to the selected product ID, that conditional is in there saying if this item is equal to the ID that we're looking for, then it's equal to full item. Yeah. Let's see, other than that, this is the Redux flow. This is not going to make any sense to anybody right now, but just wanted to give you guys a quick idea what you're going to be getting into in a couple weeks. So we have our React components, and instead of having our entire list of methods, we create actions. So each action, each function, each method will have its own JS file, and then we'll run that to a store. And what the store does essentially is it's like a catalog almost of every single action you have inside of your did I delete my yeah I did whoops inside of your app. I was just here. I'm really tired, guys. I apologize. So this is what the reducer looks like. So see, I have I just decided to name it with an X just so there's no confusion. But essentially what I'm doing here with Redux is I'm importing all of my functions and all of my methods, and then I'm telling my app what to do with the overarching state. So remember I said Redux has like one full encompassing state and then separate states and all of its components. This reducer is the state. Pardon me. This reducer essentially is the state. So instead of having, you know, state here, state there, state here, state there, you can have everything that you want to save in one location instead of having to keep track of it between all of your components. And then an example of an action, let's do receive weather because that one's nuts. This one didn't work. But yeah, so this would be an example of an action that you would dispatch. So you have to declare the type, you have to declare that you're exporting it, callback type, which is how the reducer knows what action it is, and then down here we're once again exporting an anonymous function to dispatch this fetch to this API to then give me the data, blah, blah, blah. So yeah. Redux really breaks, so like if you can think of React as breaking down EJS, Redux breaks it down even further, you know? So instead of having all your functions on the page, you have your functions in one spot, you have your functions that anticipate those functions being run in one spot, you have your views in one spot. There's a lot. But as far as React goes, that's kind of all I got. This is Redux. Any questions?
Question, like, I was just learning, like, set state is asynchronous.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're, like, calling an API and you're setting the state, can you use, can you make your classes, like, async functions or?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. What you could do is just have it so the class calls another method or another function that has like a timeout or something on it. I'm sorry, I'm really tired. So you would probably wait. So sorry. Rephrase. Restate your question.
We'll say, like, you're setting your state from an API or something.
I do that the
Like,
moment.
How do you, like, make, I don't know, awake set state before you call the API?
If I'm setting the state based upon an API call, that's the first thing I do. So that way, since it's, even though it's asynchronous, if it's the first thing it does, here, let me see. Like on app.js, that's like the first thing I do. So you're trying to do like multiple API calls at once with set state.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, making an async function, a class an async.
I'm sure you could do async await. I'm not too familiar as to how async await works. It's been a while, and I've been working a lot in C. But async await would probably be the answer to that. There's another one that I'm forgetting. It's like try catch or something like that. But yeah, I would try to separate the concerns and just make it so the user hits one button for one API call and another button for another API call, because that's what I did with this project. But I wouldn't recommend doing two API calls with one action or like one function.
Okay, yeah, I was just thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Dana. Appreciate it. Any other questions, guys? I know this was a little impromptu. Have any of you guys heard of Corsetro? Corsetro? No? This guy's awesome. I love this guy's channel, and he has a 51-minute video on just React and talking about it. You know, maybe some of the more, you know, confusing parts that you don't really understand. This is a great video. He's a great narrator. I really like this video, so I'm definitely going to slack this out.
right here.
Oh, it's only coming up. So I'll slack this out. I'll slack out the React documentation. I don't know how necessary that is, but yeah. Are there any other questions? Good. Awesome. Thanks, guys. So I'll start working on the grading now that I'm done with the lecture, and then if you guys have any questions or anything, feel free to Slack me.